And as you can see there, we're going to record the main part of the presentation. We'll stop the recording at the end of that so that you can feel free to engage in unrestricted discussion and debate. So it's a real pleasure today to have a presenting duo. We've got Paul Seabright and Selin Goksel. So Paul is Professor of Economics at the University of Toulouse in France and former director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. He's done theoretical, experimental and field research on the foundations of social trust, gender differences in networking behavior, and the economics of religious organizations. And he's currently visiting All Souls College in Oxford, which is how I got to know him through Cecilia Hayes, on a 2-year fellowship where he's working on a book entitled The Origins of Enchantment, How Religions Compete. And together with Paul, there's Selin Goksel, who is a 5th-year PhD candidate in marketing at London Business School. And Selin conducts research in judgment and decision-making, and she's primarily interested in how consumers make decisions about their health and well-being. And so her research is exploring psychological, social, and emotional factors that influence people's decisions about health-related issues. So we're very grateful that they both are joining us this morning. This is a topic, I think, that is somewhat different to what we've heard in previous consciousness clubs. We're making a foray into the territory of religion, but it's also, from what I hear of what Paul and Selin have been working on, closely related to interests that many of us have in the group on belief formation, belief updating, and so forth. So we're really looking forward to your talk. Thanks very much for joining us. And I'll hand over to Paul, I think, who's going to open up your talk.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. We're very excited to be presenting this to a group of people with interests that go way outside our normal comfort zone. I should say that Selin and I started working on this a few years back before she started her PhD at LBS, when she was doing a master's degree in Toulouse. And as you very kindly mentioned, I've been working on the economics of religious competition for some time. And Selin was working on factors that affect beliefs. And so there seemed to be a kind of natural overlap between us, and I'll describe a little bit more about the detailed motivation for that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give 5 to 10 minutes of introduction and motivation for the talk. Maybe Selin, you could move on a slide and show just what how we're going to structure the talk. So I'm going to do parts 1 and 2, motivation and literature, and then leave Selin to do the tough stuff, which is 3, 4, and 5. And I'll then come back and wave my hands a bit more for the take-home messages. If you could move on, Selin. The thing that we first began discussing when Selin was doing her master's in Toulouse was the question whether among the influences on human decision-making, and we were very much thinking in terms of economically relevant decision-making at that point, were so-called narrative frames. Now, as many of you will know, there's been a huge interest for a long time in so-called heuristics and biases, which affect judgments of probability, often in circumstances where there can be very significant economic consequences of the heuristics and biases concerned. But coming as I did from thinking about the economics of religious competition, I was very interested in the notion that framing a set of events as a narrative may affect the way in which we think about the likelihood of various outcomes. And to my knowledge, that had not really been studied in the same way that the heuristics and biases literature had studied influences on belief formation. And so that was the kind of natural point of contact between our two sources of interest. And so what I mean by narrative frames is something that I can't really go into in a lot of detail today, but you'll instantly recognize a number of things which we pick up very frequently, whether it's from reading the press, watching Hollywood movies, and so on. Ideas like the triumph of good over evil, the perfectibility of humankind, the fact that virtue will be rewarded in the end, and the importance of maintaining an optimistic attitude in the face of various kinds of setbacks. Now, these may or may not be good moral maxims for sort of making sense of your life. What interested us was, do they actually affect in a meaningful way judgments of probability? And in particular, we were wondering about, I've been thinking quite a lot about venture capital and how venture capitalists make difficult judgments of probability when seeking how to decide what kinds of projects to back. And incidentally, in parenthesis, I'd like to draw your attention to an absolutely excellent book on the history of venture capital by Sebastian Malaby, which has just come out from, I think, Viking Penguin, and which actually I've reviewed in this week's TLS very enthusiastically. And part of what the challenge that venture capitalists have to meet is that most of their projects fail, but a small number succeed very well indeed, more than well enough to offset the costs of those that fail. And therefore, it really, really matters, if you're a venture capitalist, to be able to be slightly better than the average in figuring out which are the right projects to back among the very many possible projects that you could back. And so one of the questions that we were curious about was whether economic decisions like those of which venture capital projects to back could be subject to biases because of frames. So for example, if you have a venture capitalist looking at a range of projects, and some of the entrepreneurs behind these projects are particularly attractive from a narrative point of view. Imagine that, say, you're looking at an entrepreneur whose spouse has died, and that explains why they failed before. But you really want the tragedy of their dead spouse to somehow be improved on or be overcome in the later narrative arc of their life. Are you going to be more inclined to give their project the thumbs up because you judge it more likely to work? And so we were wondering, first of all, whether there were certain kinds of narrative biases that everybody might be subject to. And more specifically, we wanted to know whether narrative biases could be reinforced by a number of personal characteristics. We thought of some obvious ones like levels of education and so on, but we were specifically interested in the idea that certain personal characteristics, of which we particularly focused on religiosity and an interest in fiction, including both novels and movies and theatre performances, which we interpret as being, in some sense, open to non-empirical accounts of reality or willing to suspend disbelief about certain empirical characteristics of the world in order to think through the consequences of a certain narrative arc. We wanted to know whether those narrative frames in which people could look at the world might be reinforced by personal characteristics which make people particularly open to those narrative frames. So that's the kind of big picture background. Now, if you could move on to the next slide, it's, I think, obvious to all of you that every day we perform statistical tasks involving assessing the likelihood of different outcomes from incoming signals. So whether it's trying to predict movements in the stock market, whether it's trying to make medical predictions about the risks of various treatments or the dangers of outcomes, or as simple as when we take a car to work and we want to decide which road to take, and we're trying to predict, or perhaps what time of day to go, we're trying to predict the likelihood that there'll be a traffic jam. We're using a large number of signals that come into us, and we're forming probability judgments based on that. I mean, this to this audience, this is banal and obvious. And so I'm also going to go rather rapidly through the literature. Most of you will know this. There is an interesting tension, I would say, in the literature between a large literature going well back to the 1960s that basically tries to say, actually, there are normative benchmarks in probability and theory and statistics, and particularly Bayesian benchmark theories, which provide a pretty good understanding of people's statistical abilities. And this isn't just educated people or people who have science degrees, that even pre-verbal human infants, older children, and some non-human primates have been modeled as having what, at least in terms of the prior beliefs of the researchers, seem like very sophisticated forms of statistical understanding that obey, at least qualitatively, if not quantitatively, many of the characteristics of Bayesian probability theory. And there are many sophisticated probabilistic models of cognition which have been developed since. So there's a paper by Andy Clark, a paper by Tenenbaum and al., which are quite well known now, which use essentially tiered models of cognition, which obey essentially the rules of Bayesian updating, and which are judged by those authors to be pretty good descriptions of how most human cognition works. And indeed, I think, if I remember rightly, Andy Clark's paper begins by saying all of cognition is basically error reduction. And I've forgotten who he attributes that quote to, but many of you will know that. Could you move on, Selin, to the next one? So what's interesting is that there's a bit of a tension between this literature, which emphasizes the sophistication and, broadly speaking, Bayesian character of most models of human cognition, with a vast literature going well back to the 1960s in psychology and to the early 1980s in behavioral economics, suggesting that there are systematic departures from Bayesian updating in the way in which most people make their decisions. So there's a paper by Edwards et al. Back in 1963 saying that individuals are conservative Bayesians. That's to say they update their beliefs much less than Bayes' law would require them by most reasonable criteria. And then there's the famous literature in behavioral economics going back to Kahneman and Tversky, looking at the various heuristics and biases which people have when they make statistical inferences, including some obvious non-Bayesian features like failure to take into account baseline probabilities of certain things, like, for example, frequencies of disease in the population. And there is a more recent literature suggesting that people's statistical ability can be very much influenced by the kind of experimental protocol they face. So people aren't very good at seeing through the secondary features of the statistical protocol to what you might think of as the primary statistical characteristics of the task they're being required to undertake. So if you could move on, Selin, let me then summarize that what we want to do in this study to pursue the big picture question that I mentioned at the beginning is that we want to investigate factors that improve and impair probabilistic reasoning. And we've divided these into two groups. There are characteristics of the inference task. First of all, the statistical properties of the task. And we have three separate experiments that have identical statistical properties, but different secondary properties. And those secondary properties are particularly the framing of outcomes in terms of, for example, whether outcomes are described as successes or failures, and whether the successes or failures are described as being due to luck or to merit. And then we have, in a relatively familiar way, a whole battery of questions about people's personal characteristics, their education levels, their cognitive skill as revealed in other tasks, various standard personality traits, and then the sort of more novel bit, which is the extent to which they're attached to what we think of as sources of non-empirical beliefs like religion or fiction. And again, we're trying to be neutral about this. We're not trying to say that there isn't a place in cognition for religious or beliefs or an attachment to fiction, but just suggesting that they may involve a different process, which is willingness to suspend disbelief and willingness in some sense to look at various non-empirical characteristics of the world, which might detract attention from concentration on the statistical underlying properties. So I think that's finished with me. I can now hand over to Selin, who can talk you through the experiment and the results.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for being here to listen to this project. So on the next slides, I'm going to talk about first the design of the experiments that we have, and then move on to results to present the results in a comparative manner so that we can test also the robustness of the effects and detect how the effects might change with the additional factors that we have in upcoming studies. Basically, just for an overview, we have three experiments where we first started with narrative-free task with a very simple task to assess people's basic abilities for making statistical inferences. And then we moved on to a more financial setting in experiments 2 and 3 to mention and test the idea regarding investment decisions, as Paul was mentioning, the venture capitalists. And here, instead of that, we look at regular individuals' decisions regarding investing in crowd-funded projects and try to understand how the framing of these projects and additional experiment 3, the possibility of getting social learning information from others may influence people's judgments and their ability in making correct inferences. And across all these studies, we always collected data through Prolific with a representative sample of US adults. We pre-registered our methods, and we also offered bonus payments in all of our studies to make sure that people do actually put the effort in an incentive compatible design to perform well as they would in real life judgments. So you will see that across all of the experiments, we always have an inherent statistical task that doesn't change very much with its basic design. But as Paul mentioned, it will have different various factors that change across experiments. The first experiment starts with a very simple task of an urn and balls, where we told participants that there is an urn that is filled with 2 types of balls, blue and yellow balls. This proportion of the true proportion of yellow balls in the urn was randomly determined for each participant from a uniform distribution. However, participants did not know this information. Instead, their task in this game was to make consecutive draws with replacement from the urn and try to guess what is the true proportion of yellow or blue balls in this urn. So specifically, as participants were going through the experiments, and making draws, they would see either one of the 2 pictures in each draw and would have the opportunity to observe whether the ball they draw is a yellow or a blue ball. And the likelihood that they will get one of the 2 balls was determined by the randomly set proportion in the beginning of the study, such that all the participants could get different proportions of yellow and blue balls from their sample of 12 draws. And throughout this process, we asked participants to make 3 guesses in total, meaning that they made 1 guess after every 4 observations. And we varied the random version of the question that they will get, and participants either answered at each question the probability that the next ball will be yellow or the probability that the next ball will be blue. After participants completed all of their guesses, we also collected some information regarding their personal characteristics, including a measure of Big 5 personality traits, measures related to competitiveness, optimism, risk aversion. Then we moved on to collect more information about their attachment to non-empirical beliefs, which was more of our variables of interest, as Paul described in the beginning, where we had measures regarding their religiosity and their interest in fiction, such as how often they pray, whether they believe in fate, or how frequently they read novels or watch movies, etc. And at the end, we also collected information about their political views and their background information. So in sum, the purpose of this experiment was to build a benchmark to assess whether any of these factors influence people's ability to make statistical inferences in a narrative-free setting, so that we could use this as a benchmark to compare people's performance in settings where narrative frames are prevalent. And specifically, we were interested in the narrative frames within investment decisions. That's why in experiments 2 and 3, we moved on to the setting where individuals make judgments and decisions regarding investing in crowd-funded projects. So these studies also included a statistical task that's similar to experiment 1. However, here we just first ask individuals to imagine that they're going to make an investment on a crowdfunding platform. We said that this platform has already funded 100 projects. And again, similar to before, the proportion of successful projects was randomly determined from a uniform distribution, which the participants did not observe. And instead, they made 12 consecutive draws with replacement to get information about previously funded projects. So the purpose here was for them to see a small sample from the population and try to guess what is the true proportion of successful or failed projects in the pool. And every time participants made a draw, they were presented with a vignette regarding the one project, which included 3 different types of information. First, they read about what was the content of the project, whether it was an idea related to a humanitarian venture or a commercial-based venture. Next, they read whether this project actually succeeded or failed. And finally, they also read some description about the reason behind this failure or success. So because we were interested about how people make judgments regarding ability versus chance motivated behavioral outcomes, we manipulated these reasons by attaching them either to the ability or merit of the entrepreneur and the firm, or luck-related factors that can happen out of chance in real life. So more specifically, here's an example of a successful vignette. How we constructed these vignettes is that we had a list of options for types of projects and the reasons. And each time participants made a draw, these vignettes were randomly generated for them so that they would see a different type of combination and they could see any combination throughout their 12 draws. In this specific vignette, for example, they read that the project was about production of a low-cost cooling system to use in rural communities to signal that this had more of a humanitarian purpose. Then they also read that this project was successful due to a well-known celebrity coming across the venture and advertising it. And this reason was intended to signal that the reason of this success is more related to luck rather than particular ability of the entrepreneur. On the other hand, participants could have also seen a vignette like this, where they read that the project is about development of a 3D laser printers, which is more of a commercial idea. And this project failed because of miscalculation of production costs to signal that the reason behind this failure is rather related to the incompetence or inability of the entrepreneur or the firm. So similar to the previous experiment, as they made these 12 draws, they also made 3 guesses in total, 1 guess after every 4 observations, where participants were asked to guess either the probability that the next project is going to be successful or will be a failed project. And at the end, we similarly collected information about other variables related to personal characteristics. In sum, the purpose of experiment 2 was to introduce this narrative framing behind the idea of virtual capitalist investments and to assess how framings related to successful versus failed outcomes, as well as the reasons behind these outcomes, could influence people's perceptions. And as a second step, also to assess whether there are any personal characteristics that might even interact with such narrative frames, such that, for example, does a religious person judge outcomes of luck versus ability differently than a non-religious person? And as a last step, we realized that we also wanted to assess not only people's ability by themselves alone, but also the fact that people might be observing information about from others in real life. When we make statistical tasks, for example, about traffic, we might also observe decisions made by others and how accurate their estimations were. So we introduced this social learning opportunity in our last experiment by using the exact same design as experiment 2 of the crowd-funded tasks. And here, when participants came to make their last guess, they were given an opportunity to get social learning information. To do this, we did a matching algorithm where we had participants in experiment 3 matched with participants who have already took part in experiment 2, so that they could see information about what those participants' guesses were. And this match was made based on the percent of successful projects that was assigned to all these participants in the beginning. So for example, if a participant in experiment 3 was assigned to a project pool of 40% of successful projects, they had the chance to see the guesses of another individual or group of individuals who also made draws from a project pool with 40% successful projects. And in addition to introducing this, we also wanted to assess whether different formats and ways of providing the social learning information matters. And we manipulated 2 things in particular. One, we manipulated whether participants get this information of the estimation of a single participant versus a group of participants. And the second thing is whether we manipulated whether participants got this right before they made their third guess in the game, or they got this after the third guess and then were given an opportunity to update their guess. So to be more specific, here's an example of a participant who got the information from a single participant in experiment 2 and saw it before making the third guess. Specifically, this participant read that there was another person who completed the same survey and made observations from the same project pool, and that this person's guess was 50 after making their observations. Then we asked them to assess what they think their final guess is on the probability of success or failure of a next project. And similarly, another person who would get this information after making the guess from multiple previous participants would see a screen like this, where they read that several other participants completed the same survey, and the average of their guesses from this survey was 57. Then because these participants have already made a guess on the final estimation, we reminded them what their guesses was and asked them if they would like to update. So in other sense, actually the people in the multiple observation group received more information because they got this social learning information from observations of several individuals who had the same project pool, but might have observed different samples after their consecutive draws. So we, on a rational basis, predicted that this might improve the outcome of social learning when it comes from multiple individuals. And similarly, we collected the same measures as in the previous studies. And then the purpose of this experiment 3 in particular was twofold. One, to compare the findings here to experiment 2, which had a very similar design, and to assess whether whatever we find in experiment 2 is robust. And second, to include this effect of social learning and see how that differentiates from previous participants. So before we move on to the results, first, we'd like to talk about how we define our measures of performance.
Selin, can I just ask a quick question about the design of the crowdfunding experiments? So sure. Were people encouraged to treat each of the samples as non-independent in the sense that they were told that the website imposed a certain distribution on the likelihood of success? Because I can imagine that unlike the earn task in the crowdfunding task, people might just think that these are all independent projects with their own chance of success rather than it being due to some higher order factor.
Yes, so thanks for the clarification. They were actually independent projects, and participants read in the beginning that here is a pool of 100 projects funded by the same crowdfunding platform. However, these projects are run by different entrepreneurs, are completely unrelated to each other. So basically, we just wanted them to have a sense of a crowdfunding platform that just provides services to connect investors with consumers who might consider putting their money into different crowdfunded platforms, so that the proportion of the successes comes from kind of putting together all the projects that have been funded through this platform, and they're just trying to make guesses about what the true proportion of successful projects are in this platform, which might signal something about the quality of the platform itself, but we are not really interested in that specifically.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Sure. So going back to the results before we move on, as you remember from the beginning, we're interested in assessing factors that influence people's performance in the statistical task, which is their accuracy or bias when they making their judgments. That's why we created these two types of variables, where we define bias by the difference between people's last guess to the relative to the true value in the population. In other words, for example, if someone was assigned a project pool of 40% successful projects and they guess 50, we would say that this person is upward biased by 10 percentage points. And if they were to guess 30, this person would be downward biased by 10 percentage points. And then we also created a measure of inaccuracy, which is the absolute value of bias, meaning that those individuals who are upward or downward biased by 10 percentage points would have the same inaccuracy level of being 10 percentage points away from the true value. Then the second decision we needed to make in this setting is how to define the true value. So in a statistical task, by true value, we actually need to define what we think is the optimal guess of individuals, given that they can only observe a small sample from a population. So one way to go about this with respect to the literature is to use Bayesian updating. If we were to know what people's true priors were about the proportion of successful projects or proportion of yellow balls in an urn, we could use this prior and use the Bayesian rule to update and find out what their optimal guesses should be. However, in this setting, because we did not tell participants what the underlying distribution is, we didn't know what their true priors are. And it could have been also that people have different priors, which are also influenced by different factors. So in order to go about this issue, we created two different versions of our variables by having two different benchmarks for our true value. So first, we created our unconditional variables, where we define true value as the actual proportion in the population. So that is the randomly assigned proportion of the balls or projects at the beginning of the experiment. However, one issue with these measures is that participants make observations from a pool of hundreds, but they only observe a very small sample. So there might be groups of participants who actually end up observing samples that are quite unrepresentative of the true population. And for those individuals, there is an additional noise in the data, because when they have error-prone estimations, this error might be due to partly their own ability and cognitive shortcomings, but it can also be related to them observing just a bad sample. And in order to remove this noise from this observation, we created a second set of conditional variables, where instead now we took the true value as their observed proportion in the randomly drawn sample. So in other words, we are assessing in the conditional variables their ability of how close they come to whatever they observed in the sample. So this lets us take out this noise from the design. But obviously, if we were to run this with a very large sample and still randomize across all the outcomes, we should expect the conditional variables to converge to our unconditional ones. However, for the purposes of the current experiments, we are going to talk about the results on our conditional variables, where people on average are more accurate in making predictions. But just bear in mind that when we look at the robustness on unconditional variables, we do find similar findings, with the exception that, as expected, these findings are weaker relative to conditional variables because of this inherent noise in the construction. So to start with our first set of results. So here is a big table that compares our regression results across the three studies. The dependent variable is conditional inaccuracy, and we are particularly interested in understanding the effect of personal characteristics and task-related characteristics on the inaccuracy of individuals across the three studies. And here we include a set of exploratory variables. First, let me start by explaining the variables that are common across all the three studies. In terms of the characteristics of the decision task, this included two variables. One, question type, which reflected whether participants responded to a proportion of yellow or blue balls in study 1, or successful or failed project in studies 2 and 3. Then we included a measure of extremity, which we define as how far away the true proportion assigned to participants is from 50%. So for example, someone getting a 90% successful project pool will have received a more extreme pool than someone with 60%. Then we included the measures related to the attachment of non-empirical beliefs, which was our variables of interest. Religiosity, namely to construct this measure, we took the first principal component of the 4 measures of religiosity that we had regarding religious beliefs, faith, and attending services. And we also included a variable about their interest in fiction which is again a principal component of their interest in reading novels, going to movies, attending theater. Next, we included the additional personal characteristics. Here you will see only a selected number because these are the factors that have been significant in one study, but where we did not really find robust effect across the other studies. However, the other factors that we have measured, for example, other big 5 personality traits, are included as controls across all of these regressions. And finally, we also got some information about their beliefs in the COVID situation because we just wanted to make sure that we control for that, given the specific time. So these were all the variables that were constant across studies 1, 2, and 3. Now, the interesting results we see looking at these 3 regressions is, first of all, maybe not that surprisingly, extremity leads to a more inaccurate judgment. So individuals who receive project pools with heavily high percentage of successful projects make more inaccurate judgments. So this was not that surprising for us. However, what we found interesting was particularly the results in religion, which we predicted that they would increase inaccuracy. But the interesting thing is that actually across all of the experiments, including experiment 1, where we did not have a narrative frame, religiosity does increase the inaccuracy of people's predictions. And when we look at the coefficients of these experiments, they actually also do not vary very much across the experiments. So the narrative frame does still lead to religious people to be more inaccurate, but this is true regardless of whether the narrative is there or not. And I'm going to get more details into that interpretation later. And the second thing is that initially in the first study, we were very excited to see that interest in fiction also works as religion in terms of increasing inaccuracy in predictions. However, later on in studies 2 and 3, this did not hold very robust, as the effect was smaller and less significant or non-significant as in study 2. So having said that, across the first 3 studies, our main interest was to understand what is going on with this religiosity measure. And then to add on that, when we moved on to look at only studies 2 and 3, we included the variables that were specific to the design of those statistical tasks, specifically about this crowdfunding investments people were asked to make. So we added these variables, exploratory variables at the end, which are related to the percent of failed projects that they saw in their sample, the percent of luck-related explanations relative to ability-related explanations, the share of humanitarian versus commercial projects. And then finally, on study 3, we also included whether participants have seen social learning information and whether this information came from single versus multiple participants. So interestingly, we actually do not see a direct effect of different proportion of failure rates or different ratio of luck-related reasons on the effect of inaccuracy on people's predictions. One thing we do see is that when we look at the last study only, we compared the group of participants in the crowdfunding study who received the social learning only after making the 3rd guess, which means that their 3rd guess was free of social learning, to other individuals who made this guess after receiving the social learning information, which means that they got treated with social learning, and the only difference was whether they got the information from a single or multiple participants. And we see that regardless of whether the social learning comes from a single or multiple participants, it does improve accuracy relative to those who did not have this information. As a next step, we wanted to explore the effect of these factors not only on inaccuracy, but also see how that influences bias. But before we move on to the bias, actually, I wanted to quickly show these details of the religiosity and how that appears on the plot. So basically here we have the 3 plots of the conditional inaccuracy across the 3 studies. And we split this distribution by whether participants have scored above or below median on religiosity. And what we find is that consistently across the 3 studies, those individuals who score above median have higher levels of inaccuracy. So this was one particular finding that we wanted to explore a bit more. And before that, we wanted to see whether these effects are also consistent on conditional bias. Now, here we have the exact same regressions from before in terms of the exploratory variables, with the exception that the dependent variable is conditional bias instead of conditional inaccuracy. However, now we don't see the effect of religiosity or interest in fiction anymore. And our interpretation of this is that there might be people, religious people, who have been upward biased, but there might also be people who have been downward biased. And these two biases cancel each other out on average. So we don't see, in other words, a systematic bias. However, existence of the various heterogeneous biases do lead to more inaccurate judgments when we look at accuracy. The only new information that comes from the analysis on bias is actually on the percent of failed projects. This variable specifically highlights the percent of failures participants saw in their own sample, not the true population, and tells us that across the studies 2 and 3 in the crowdfunding setting, the more participants see failed projects, the more upward biased they were in guessing the true proportion of successful projects is higher. As a next step, we wanted to put together these findings of failure with religiosity. So as you may remember from the beginning of the presentation, we're not only interested in the personal characteristics itself, namely how religious works, but also to see how these personal characteristics might interact with the narrative frames. And studies 2 and 3 gives us the opportunity to look at that more closely, where we can now interact the religiosity term with the narrative frames that have been imposed in studies 2 and 3. So here we add these two interactions. One, we interact the religiosity with the percent of failed projects. And two, we interact the religiosity with a dummy variable that represents when participants saw a low level of luck-related explanation. At the same time, this means that they saw a high level of ability-related explanations. So overall, we see a few things here. First, when we look at religiosity in itself, we see that overall religious people are actually downward biased, which can be interpreted that they're more pessimistic about probability of success. However, on the other hand, when individuals see higher percentages of failure, as we also saw in the previous results, they are upward biased. So the more failed projects they observe, the more likely they are to report higher percentage of successful projects. And this is particularly true for religious individuals because of this interaction. As people are more religious, and when they observe more percentages of failed projects, they become even more upward biased in their predictions. And in addition to that, we also see that when people are religious and observe high failed projects, and also observe that the reasons behind these projects are highly not related to luck, in other words, highly related to ability, they become even more so upward biased in their predictions. However, these findings on low luck interaction is not that robust, as we see that it's only marginally significant in study 3. But our interpretation of this is that when people are religious and they observe high levels of failures that are related to ability, they are more forgiving of these failures. However, when they see failures that are more related to luck-related reasons, then they are less forgiving of such failures. However, while we are more confident in making the connection between how religiosity increases the upward bias on observing failed outcomes, we are not as confident in making the same judgment regarding merit versus luck observations. As a next step, we also looked at the same effects of how religiosity might interact with the narrative framing in terms of inaccuracy. And interestingly, we don't see that interaction anymore here. So in other words, we do find it interesting that religiosity leads to higher inaccuracy in itself, but contrary to our predictions, it does not interact to lead to more inaccurate judgments with respect to high failures or low luck variables in our settings. However, although it has additional biasing factors. So one way we interpret this is that there are existing biases with religiosity interacting with narrative factors. However, these biases are probably not strong enough to lead to more inaccurate judgments overall. And we only have the effect of religiosity in itself affecting inaccuracy. So as a last step before wrapping up the results, I would like to talk about the social learning element that was only existent in experiment 3. So here are some plots, and we'll walk through these as the following. The first 2 plots on the upper side of the slide compare individuals' guesses when they get social learning information versus when they do not get social learning information. The one on the left here looks at the bias and actually tells us that the bias is not that different, whether people receive social learning or not, which was what we also saw in our regression analysis. And the one on the right here tells us that when people get social learning information, conditional inaccuracy improves with this information relative to no information. And then when you look at the lower 2 plots, we are just plotting the distribution of bias in terms of what type of social learning information they got. So the one on the left here shows us that regardless of whether people got the social learning information before or after making a third guess, it is equally effective on improving their inaccuracy and does not have a different effect on their bias. And similarly, the plot on the right-hand side shows us that regardless of whether this information comes from multiple or single participants, again, it is still similarly effective on their judgments. As a last thing, we were also interested in the group of participants who received the social learning information after making a third guess in the experiment. So one thing specific to these participants were that before they took into account the social learning, they made a guess, and then they updated their guess if they wanted to fit social learning. And we wanted to understand whether the factor that participants might receive a social learning information that is more or less different from their own guess might influence how they also update their guesses. In other words, it might influence the extent to which they take this information into account when forming their final guesses. Here we look at how on the plot on the left-hand side, how providing information from single or multiple individuals changes the effect of this discrepancy, which is the difference we define between their own guess and the social learning information. And we see that the farther away the information they got is from their own perceptions, own guesses on the last guess, the more likely people are when this information comes from multiple individuals rather than a single individual. And this makes complete rational sense because that information should be more valuable, and people do take that into account and recognize that and update their guesses more accordingly. And the plot on the left is looking at the gender effects, which is actually not something we predicted from the beginning. And we are not sure if these results are going to hold robust. But what we find is that the more the discrepancy is between what people guess themselves and what they see from social learning, females are more likely to update to a greater degree relative to male individuals. And we also observe these findings when we look at a regression that looks at the effect of discrepancy on people's updating behavior in study 3. We see that the more the discrepancy is, the more different the social learning information is from their own guess, the more they update. However, this updating is of a lower level when this information comes from a single person relative to multiple people. But this updating is to a higher level when the person updating the participant is a female participant relative to a male participant. So this is just the result that we are not that sure of the robustness because we get to only test this in these experiments. However, we did find these interesting in giving some insights about personal characteristics that might influence how people also take into account the social learning information. So having said that, this concludes all the results that we would like to present today, and I'm going to hand it over back to Paul to wrap it up and then start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selin. So I'll try and be quick about this. I mean, as you'll have gathered from this, we were interested in the impact of differing levels of religiosity on both bias and inaccuracy. And what I'd like to do is to contrast what we see in terms of bias and inaccuracy with everybody with the comparison between relatively more religious and less religious individuals. So we see that everybody is downward biased when they observe high success rates. They don't believe that the success rates they've observed are characteristic of the, or are fully characteristic of the underlying distribution in the population. And similarly, everybody's upward biased when they observe high failure rates. They are more likely to suppose that these failure rates are uncharacteristic of the underlying distribution in the population. Now, we can't really judge the rationality of those biases because, of course, we don't know whether people share in their priors the true underlying distribution of the outcomes in the population. Maybe they think that the underlying distribution is a bell curve or something like that, and that would be let's say a rational justification for their having those biases. Now, what is more interesting is when we can compare more to less religious individuals. We see that the more religious individuals are more biased in each direction, and as a result, they're less accurate overall. What is interesting is that they're particularly more biased when they observe higher failure rates. So in other words, the divergence between religious and non-religious individuals in the degree of bias is greater when they observe higher failure rates. And in all three studies, they're more inaccurate than the less religious individuals. But what is interesting, and to be honest, slightly surprising to us, was that they're not more inaccurate in the presence of this framing in terms of success and failure than they are in the baseline test. So, I could say that we see the success failure framing does seem to induce biases, which we can broadly interpret in terms of some of these narrative ideas that, for example, people want to believe that, and in the perfectibility of human endeavor, that things are better. They may have failed in the past, but they're going to be better in the future. But what's interesting is that they don't interact with this personal characteristic of religiosity. The more religious individuals are just less good at doing the inference, but they don't seem to be more so in the presence of these narrative frames. And Selin put it, I think, well when she said that what we have is various biases that are idiosyncratic to particular personality subgroups, but the overall sum of those biases is not really very different between the groups, so that we don't see a greater degree of inaccuracy in the more religious subgroups. Now, what's interesting to us is that the effects of religion on inaccuracy replicate very strongly across all three studies. We're still a bit cautious about this because, as you will have seen, particularly in the very first slide that Selin put up, quite a few of the things we thought might be relevant do not replicate. In fact, I still remember when the results came back from study one, we saw that there was a strong effect of the female dummy on inaccuracy. And we thought, my God, we're apparently showing that women are less good at these tasks. And that doesn't replicate. In fact, in the last study, women are very systematically more accurate than men, not less accurate than men. So that particular thing just simply didn't replicate. And so one of the things we're naturally curious about is, could it be that our apparent replication of this religion effect across all three studies might have something to do with, I don't know, the platform on which we did this, or the fact that it's, American subjects drawn from a particular pool, or whatever, And so in our future work, if people think this is interesting enough to fund us to do this, then we would very much like to do this on a much larger scale with a more international subject pool, with people from different religions, and try to see whether we can replicate this in a more robust setting. And we would very much welcome the reactions of people in this Zoom room as to ways in which we might do this. Strikingly also, most other personality correlates do not replicate across the studies. And we're glad we did this in this pre-registered independent experiment way so that we can get some sense of whether we're getting robust replication, because we were, if we had done them all together in one big study, then we might have come up with things without any real sense of which of these findings were robust or not. So if we can move to the very last slide on social learning, it is very clear that learning from others makes decision makers more accurate. So very clear effect on inaccuracy of the social learning in the last experiment. Of course, we haven't replicated that, it's just one experiment. And for the specific subset of people for whom we have two guesses, one before they receive the social information and one afterwards, we see that they respond positively to the discrepancy between their own guess and the guesses of others. We see that they respond more to that discrepancy when observing guesses from multiple others. And interestingly, we see that women respond more to the discrepancy than men. Now, one possibility is that our results of gender on inaccuracy may not actually be completely due to lack of robustness, but it's possible that the nature of the task interested our male and female subjects differentially to different degrees across the studies. Maybe the blue-yellow ball task was sort of seen as more like remembering football scores or something that maybe our female subjects were less interested in. Maybe they were more interested in the more human versions of the stories that we gave in the second. That's all obviously completely superficial speculation at this point. But one of the things we would like to do if we try to replicate this in a larger scale would be to see whether there are interesting gender interactions with the presentation of the tasks and to see whether there's anything there. But we certainly wouldn't claim there was on the basis of the results so far. But the social learning results, such as they are, and subject to the reservation that they haven't been replicated, is that participants do appear to respond to social information in ways that are consistent with rational decision making. And so I think I'll stop there and open it up to discussion and say that, as you probably gathered, we're a slightly fish out of water here. We're not used to presenting to audiences of psychologists. We do this in the tribal codes for us among economists, including behavioral economists. And so, please don't be afraid to make some very obvious comments if there are things we've obviously missed, because if you think they can't have failed to understand something so basic, the answer is we probably have failed to understand something so basic, and we would welcome being told so. Many thanks. Maybe you can unshare the screen now, Selin, and so we can have a discussion seeing who we're talking to.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Selin. We should first, in the traditional fashion, unmute and give you a round of applause for